Most people imagine conquest as something loud. Battles, burning cities, men shouting beneath torn banners. But the quiet aftermath is often far more disturbing, because sometimes victory is not proven on the battlefield. It is proven in silence, in the breaking of people who were never meant to fight, and in the slow attempt to erase something invisible: belief, identity, memory. In the late 15th century, deep inside the expanding Ottoman Empire, a small group of women were captured after their convent fell in the mountains of Thessaly. They were not soldiers. They held no weapons. They had sworn lives of prayer, isolation, and obedience. But to the machinery of empire, even that could be interpreted as resistance. And what happened to them afterward reveals something unsettling about power. Because the empire did not simply want them defeated. It wanted them transformed or erased. And that distinction changes everything. History remembers empires through their victories, through cities taken, borders redrawn, crowns replaced. But conquest does not end when the last wall collapses. That is when a more complicated struggle begins. The struggle over identity. When a powerful state absorbs new lands, it inherits something difficult to control: the beliefs of the people who lived there. Faith, tradition, memory. Those things cannot be captured with cannons. And throughout history, ruling powers have understood this simple truth. If belief survives, resistance survives. In the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire had become one of the most formidable political forces in the world. Constantinople had fallen in 1453. Former Byzantine territories were steadily absorbed. Cities that once belonged to Christian kingdoms now lived under Ottoman administration. Many communities adapted, some converted. Others paid taxes and quietly maintained their traditions. But certain institutions carried deeper symbolic weight. Monasteries, churches, convents, places where faith was not merely practiced, but preserved. Places that reminded conquered populations who they once were. And that is why the small convent in the hills of Thessaly mattered more than anyone expected. From a military perspective, it was insignificant. A stone building, a few dozen women. No wall strong enough to resist an army. But symbolically, it stood for something else. Continuity. Defiance without violence. And that kind of defiance can be deeply unsettling to authority. When Ottoman forces approached the region, the nearby villages had already emptied. Word traveled quickly in those years. Armies meant change. Sometimes survival required leaving before decisions were made. For you. But the convent did not flee. The women inside had taken vows that tied them to that place. Prayer, service, stability. For many of them, the world beyond the monastery walls was unfamiliar. They had spent decades within its quiet rhythms. The ringing of bells, morning prayers, shared meals, scripture read by candlelight, and perhaps they believed that sacred spaces still held meaning in the world outside. History would prove otherwise. The soldiers who arrived at the convent gates did not see holiness. They saw territory, another fragment of land newly folded into the empire. The gates were destroyed before sunset. The chapel was stripped. The courtyard filled with smoke and shouting. Yet something unexpected happened in the hours that followed. The soldiers expected panic. They expected begging. But the women gathered together and began to sing, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet hymn carried through the ruined courtyard. For the soldiers standing there, it must have seemed strange, because fear was the language of conquest. But these women were speaking something else entirely: acceptance, and perhaps defiance. The abbess of the convent remembered in later letters as Sister Agony was brought before the commanding officer. The terms offered to her were simple: renounce your faith, accept the authority of the conqueror. and your sisters will be spared harsher punishment. It was not an unusual offer in that era. Conversion often meant survival. Refusal meant uncertainty. But Sister Elani reportedly answered with a sentence that would echo through later accounts. I have already given my life. It was not shouted. It was not dramatic. Just a statement of fact. To a woman who had taken lifelong vows, the idea of surrendering belief may have felt like surrendering existence itself. For the officers managing the situation, this presented a different problem. Martyrs are dangerous. Dead rebels can become legends, and legends can inspire future resistance. So the solution chosen was not immediate execution. Instead, the surviving. Nuns were transported, removed from their home, removed from their community, removed from the landscape that gave their faith meaning. 22 women were forced to march south toward the coast, bound together, escorted by Ottoman horsemen. They walked for days along roads they had never traveled before. Many had never even left the valley where the convent stood. Now the Sizin world unfolded in harsh fragments. Dust, sun, the distant sound of markets and cities they did not recognize. And eventually, the sea. At the port of Volos, Ottoman galleys waited. Ships designed for cargo, soldiers, and prisoners. Not comfort. The nuns were placed among other captives. Greeks, Slavs, Italians, people gathered from different corners of the expanding empire. For 12 days, the ship crossed the Aegean and entered the Bosporus. And when the women first saw Constantinople, rising from the water, they were looking at the center of a new world. Domes, minarets, walls stretching across the hills. A city alive with trade, administration, and imperial power. For centuries, it had been the heart of Byzantium. Now it belonged to the Ottomans. And somewhere within that enormous city, the fate of these women would be decided. Captives arriving in Constantinople were usually categorized quickly. Some were sold. Some were integrated into households. Some were trained for administrative roles. The Ottoman system of governance was complex and pragmatic. But religious captives presented a different challenge, especially women who openly refused conversion. When the nuns were brought before the imperial council, interpreters explained the conditions. Conversion meant a new life, new names, food, clothing, protection. Refusal meant continued confinement and labor within the palace infrastructure. For the empire, this was not cruelty. It was administration, a structured attempt to absorb conquered populations into the faith. Imperial order, but the women remained silent. They did not debate theology. They did not protest. They simply refused. And silence can be surprisingly powerful, because it removes the possibility of negotiation. Without agreement, persuasion becomes pressure. The surviving sisters were placed in lower service chambers, beneath the palace complex. Long corridors beneath Topkapi, stone rooms with narrow slits of light. There they were assigned labor, cleaning, washing, maintaining fires for the upper quarters. It was meant to wear them down, not through violence, but through exhaustion, isolation, routine. History shows that this method has been used repeatedly by powerful institutions. Because identity rarely collapses all at once. It erodes slowly. Days become months. Months become years. And eventually, memory fades. That was the expectation. But the women adapted in a way the administrators had not anticipated. They had already lived lives of discipline. Monastic life is built around endurance, silence, limited food, repetition. For many of them, suffering was not unfamiliar. So they transformed the confinement into something else, a continuation of their vows. At night, they whispered prayers, not loudly, not in ways that would attract attention, just fragments of memory shared between them. scripture recalled imperfectly, hymns half remembered. And over time, they created something hidden. A small chamber sealed behind an unused archway in the lower corridors. There, using broken pottery for candles and scraps of cloth as an altar, they built a secret chapel. It was crude, fragile, but it allowed them to gather, to remember, to remain who they believed themselves to be. The palace guards eventually noticed something strange. Despite hunger and labor, the women carried themselves calmly. They did not beg, they did not argue, they simply continued. And this quiet persistence began to unsettle the administrators responsible for them, because transformation had not occurred. Years passed. Some of the sisters disappeared. 2 eventually accepted conversion and were relocated within the palace system. Others grew weaker, but those who remained developed a strategy that confused their captors even further. They stopped answering questions entirely. When addressed, they simply stood in silence. No insults, no refusal spoken aloud, just stillness. It made bureaucratic control difficult. Records from the Ottoman archives fragments, discovered centuries later, mention a small group of foreign captives described as unresponsive and unsuitable for service. Eventually, the number of surviving women dropped from 22 to 11. Time had done what the empire expected, but something else had happened as well, because the women had left traces behind. Small crosses scratched into stone, Latin phrases carved into walls, symbols marking who remained alive. And centuries later, when archaeologists examined sections beneath the palace ruins, they found a narrow chamber with Christian markings. A phrase partially worn by time, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. By that point, the empire that had captured the women was long gone. Sultans had risen and fallen. Borders had changed again. But the markings remained. And they raise an uncomfortable question.